Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you on our web audience, wherever you are in the world. I am Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute, and I want to welcome you to today's program, Iran's Grand Strategy of Political History. Now, when you are talking about Iranian history, you can talk about a lot of different periods. The past couple of months, which have been dramatic, the period since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, or frankly, you can go back 3,000 or 4,000 years. Today, we're going to look specifically at a book recently published by Professor Vali Nasr called Iran's Grand Strategy of Political History, and the commonalities and how Iran's history through the Pahlavi Shah period and the revolutionary period affects its foreign policy, its security policy, and its view of the world and how to interact with the world. We are very fortunate to have Professor Vali Nasr with us today, the author of the book. He is the Majid Khadduri Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and International Relations at the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. In addition to Professor Nasr, we have got our own Ali Alfoneh, Senior Fellow and Iran Analyst here at AGSI. And moderating the conversation is Dr. Hussein Ibish, Senior Resident Scholar here at AGSI. I will note that in the comments or on our website, we have got a discount code if you are interested in buying Professor Nasr's book. You'll see that on our website. And I will also note that we had some technical difficulties with our original program, and we will be joining this debate, this discussion, mid-conversation. You've lost just a couple of minutes, as it'll be obvious to see. Anyway, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Small Gulf Arab neighbors, for example, who simply lack agency when the bullets really start flying, and they have to, if they're to be wise, search for a region in which conflicts into which they might be dragged unwillingly are minimized, and that's what they're all doing. They have played some games during the decade of the Arab Spring uprisings after 2011, but now I think it's very clear that they want to work with Iran to avoid conflicts like the 12-day war with Israel, for example, which alarmed them greatly and which they did not like. It is only a person who has not followed the developments in the Gulf region for the past decade or even 2 or 3 years. Only someone like that would have fallen into the trap of believing that any of these countries were pleased that their sometime antagonist, Iran, was getting attacked by Israel and vice versa. They were not. They were alarmed and disturbed by it. So Vali Nasr has given us this fantastic book, Iran's Grand Strategy of Political History, and I'll just kind of hold it up on my phone for those who got it. It's pretty bad, but the best I can do, what you need to do is go on our website, AGSI, and use that code and get your discount and buy the book. Buy it, because Professor Nasr has given us a truly invaluable contribution to the literature on the topic. So thank you so much. And Ali Alfoneh will begin more with some questions that I have for Professor Nasr. And as we go into the conversation, Ali Alfoneh, my dear colleagues, will become more and more a part of it as we move beyond sort of the specific, well, what is this book and how do you write it, that kind of thing. And we get more into the substantive topics that the book deals with. And you'll be more and more a part of that conversation. And then, probably, I don't know, about a half hour left or something, we'll bring in the audience, because you guys are going to have a lot of questions. And I'll try to triage them as best that I can and make sure that the most urgent ones get addressed first. But please do ask us through the Q&A function. I believe that's the right way. So let me begin by asking Professor Nasr, What, how, well, a two-part question, right? Let's just get this on the record so that we can move forward, but we can't do it without understanding. How do you conceptualize this book? How would you describe it to someone? And if they don't know, and why did you write it? I mean, I have already said that there was a gaping hole in the literature on this topic, at least in English. I don't know about Farsi, but I imagine this is a unique book anyway, in all languages. But why did you write it? And what did you think you were doing? What's the nature of this project that this book is engaged in, please?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Hussein. And I want to thank AGSI for inviting me. It's truly a great honor to be here. And also to be with Ali, whose work I benefited from writing this book, and also Hussein, whose wisdom on varieties of things on the Middle East I benefit from greatly. So I couldn't ask for
Well, thank you. Maybe it's
better company.
Maybe it's worth saying that our fathers were very close friends.
That's true. Actually, the last time that I met Hussein, I think I was 6 years old.
Yeah,
he was 7 years old, and we're playing in Beirut. Good old days. But it's really great to be here with you, Hussein. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
So I mean, maybe some ways working at a School of International Affairs and working with other colleagues who work on other sets of issues that the United States grapples with, China, Russia, etc. It was very evident to me that there is a conception and the academics and policymakers about what is the game plan of the other side, what is their strategy, what they want to achieve. That there's a chessboard, if you would, that they're playing. But with Iran, to me, it sounded like it's obviously very tactical, and too often we sort of fall back on the notion that this is a theocracy, is still driven by ideology. Or when you go to the Arab world, in particular, it's still the old early 1980s view that this is all about export of the revolution. And my sense was that what is missing in policymaking and in academia largely is that an understanding of what is Iran after, what is its grand vision, and particularly because you have a continuity of leadership in Iran over a long period of time, and try to understand them in their own terms. And then as somebody who studies Iran, let's say as a social scientist, to me it appeared increasingly that we study Iran from varieties of perspectives, cultural, political, domestic politics, etc. But it is a way to think about Iran today that this is a state that war has built. Yeah. Much like Charles Tilly put it, that states make wars make states, and states make war. That it's understanding Iran today is almost impossible without thinking of it as a state that has been at war for 4 decades. Whatever the reason for that war and how it started, that basically it's been shaped by that. I recently was struck by a comment an Iranian economist said that in debates in Iran, it's been stated that look, the most important factor in Iran's economy is in confrontation with the United States. There's no other way to actually macro, etc., to put your head around where Iran is without taking into account the confrontation that has imposed sanctions, isolation, etc. So that essentially was the element. The other is obviously opportunity, because Iran, in a bizarre way, is fairly open with this information. And particularly after Iran's involvement in Syria, there was much more of a torrent of analysis of the Iran-Iraq war, foreign policy debates, which does reveal a great deal in terms of at least how the political class, this national security class, looks at issues. For instance, I've been struck since before even the Israel attack on a debate in Iran about who lost Syria, right? Which is a very sober strategic debate about what were the intelligence mistakes, what were the wrong strategic assumptions, where did we go wrong, and it tells you sort of the way that the thinking goes on, and there was a lot to sink your teeth into. And the more I read, the more it was sort of obvious that there's a story to tell. There's a I would say at a larger level about the way in which since the very beginning, Iran has viewed its role in the region, its problem with the United States, and then there's all these sort of chapters, if you would, the Iran-Iraq War, the 2003 in Iraq, now this latest chapter that basically has deepened and put them on this track. And so as the United States is grappling with now, how will Iran respond? Where is Iran going? What might the post-Khamenei era look like? I think it's important to understand where it's coming from. What are the fundamental assumptions, and how has the state evolved? And so that's largely, my attempt is just sort of through thick description, depict the fundamental strategic assumptions that Islamic Republic has been built on. And I understand that sort of there's a lot of diversity of opinion, and the Iranian public is somewhere else completely. But these kinds of debates and decisions in every country are not matter of public debate. These are made by a political class, which in Iran, in a way, is fairly homogeneous in the sense that the supreme leader, the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard, they're all essentially the veterans of the early years of the revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. There's a sort of a great deal of consensus in what they see the problem and how they want to tackle it at the higher level. And so the effort is basically to shed light on that.
Okay, so that really does help us understand the basic framework for the book. Now, it is not a history of the grand strategy of Iran throughout the ages. It's very much focused on the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it's also grounded, and this becomes incredibly important for readers like me who are not Farsi speakers and who do not, never lived in Iran, who are very much from the outside. It helps us greatly to understand the broadest historical context, right? So you do see, I believe, a through line that goes back to kind of the origins, but the earliest, or at least the earlier incarnations of the Iranian state, whether it's in the form of empire or monarchy or republic or what have you. So the through line that really strikes me is the idea of aloneness, of uniqueness, that defined Iran's thinking for certainly over 1,000 years, right? Perhaps going back to the original earliest days of the split between Sunni and Shia dominated worlds. And the idea in Iran that Iran is unique as the state of the Persians and the Shiites and Farsi-speaking Shiites. And this idea of aloneness brings a combination, as I read your text, of a kind of wariness that can easily lead into paranoia, or at least a sense of being in battle, constantly in battle, circled and surrounded by neighbors who are unfriendly or hostile global powers like Russia or the United States, the Soviet Union, etc. Now, this idea of aloneness, uniqueness, etc., also carries with it an upside, in a sense, for the regime, and so throughout history, because it seems to bestow upon Iran a set of characteristics that are, advantageous, and this can also lead to chauvinism and a kind of arrogance, right? So you've got fear that can bleed into paranoia, and you've got pride that can bleed into arrogance, and in both cases lead to mistakes. and missteps, miscalculation, maybe a better word for it. So can you talk about this? First of all, have I read it correctly? And secondly, can you, elaborate on this theme? Because it seems to me to be, central to your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've read it correctly, but the way sort of I employed this in the book, and I think it's relevant, although that's the way I saw it, that history matters in two ways here. So it's not, I didn't approach this like sort of deciphering or decoding Iranians going back to Cyrus the Great.
Yeah.
But largely what we saw sort of historians see as modern Iran, which they see it with the rise of the Safavids, not in terms of state institutions, but the boundary of Iran and identity of modern Iran largely consolidated with the Safavids.
Yeah.
That there are certain, so looking at today's Iran, Islamic Republic, there are certain problems that only the Islamic Republic fears or senses, certain paranoias that only are unique to it. And there are certain problems that it has created for itself. So that obviously comes to the book. But there are certain constants in Iran's history that also they have to grapple with. And in a way, they have their own way of grappling with it, which is a bit different, which is largely one is the geography and geostrategy of Iran. I mean, you can go back to the Safavids, and Iran's main problem is on its Arab border. Not even with the Turks, that was settled in 1501. That's probably the most stable border in the world.
Yeah.
But this border with Iraq, this fact that Iran never has a problem on its east, real problem. All of its strategic problems are fundamentally with the Arab world. This is something goes back to the Shah's period, goes to the 19th century, and goes even back to the Safavids, which struggles over Iraq with the Ottomans. And in a way, the Islamic Republic is dealing with this in its own way, as compared to the Shah and compared to the earlier period. Secondly, as you said, that Iran is, and this is acutely, there's awareness in Iran, even among the public, that they are unique in the region. Sometimes they see themselves unique. Sometimes it's because the other side sees them as unique. There's the only Persian speaking, at least in terms of identity of the country, and Shia in terms of identity of the country in the region, in a sea of, in the region that at least until recently was predominantly Sunni in its self-awareness and still probably is, and it's largely dominated by Arabs and by Turks.
Exactly.
And you're correct, this cuts both ways because, under the Safavids made Iran deliberately Shiite in order to preserve it. I mean, the irony is that Shiism was imposed from above to distinguish it from the Mongols on the one side and Uzbeks and the Ottomans on the other side. So Iran actually probably would not have survived in its current form, maybe if it wasn't for it being Shia, as well as being Persian. And then today, so that's actually the uniqueness helped them. And today you could say it has been a strategic tool in the hands of the Islamic Republic for power projection in Iraq, in Lebanon, etc. Being able to actually break out of Iran's isolation by leveraging this identity with the region. But Iran, for these reasons, also I think it's a deeply insecure state, and it's continuously grappling with national security. The Shah did in his own way in the 19th century. That was a massive preoccupation that actually the country would survive at all under imperialism. And there's an overhang of this on Iran. So there is in other words, some of the core strategic issues the Islamic Republic is dealing with as sort of the custodian of the Iranian nation state at this time have historical precedent, which means that they will continue. In other words, sort of even under a very different kind of a regime, you cannot reinvent necessarily. The second way that history plays, which I think is important, is that there's acute awareness of history in Iranian thinking. Regardless of regime, etc. And, there is an acute awareness of what happened to Iran in the 19th century, territories that it lost, even debates on Russia, whether they are helpful to Iran, they're not helpful, immediately takes you back to the 19th century and the territories that they acquired or the occupation of northern Iran in 1946, or, every bad treaty in Iran is immediately compared to the Turkmenchai Treaty of 18th century. So, and every Iranian immediately understands what that means. You don't need a tutorial to tell them what happened. Just like with 1953 coup, etc. And I think it is impossible to understand the Islamic Republic without understanding the revolution. And by that, I don't mean just the religious revolutions, but leftist revolutionaries' reading of Iranian history. I mean, I go this a lot in the book. I think sort of even Khamenei see the real accomplishment of the Islamic Republic as giving Iran independence. And that Islam is the only force that can give Iran independence. That this is the mark of their pride. Obviously, independence against whom? Now it's not Britain and France, against the United States. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, former Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif said in an interview with Ravi at Foreign Policy that Iran is the first government in 225 years to give Iran genuine independence. Now, I would bicker with that sweeping statement, but it speaks to the mindset, right?
Totally.
It is a hugely historical mindset. It didn't say that it's the first government to give Iran Islam, genuine Islam. It's about this kind of vision. So again, history did not start with the Islamic Republic. They cannot divorce the history. They're actually prisoner of the history and their own reading of the history. And I think that's what probably is being intensely now debated within Iran in terms of how can you reread that history. I was reminded of this. I shared my analysis of the Mossadegh period with an Iranian university professor. Mine is a little unorthodox, let me put it that way, given the general.
We will talk.
We'll get about it.
Yeah,
and he said to me that this would be really popular on Iranian campuses if my students read it. I said, really? I said, what are they saying? He said, well, they also, like you say, it was Mossadegh's own fault. And he said they refuse to refer to it as a coup. I said, well, what do they refer to the 1953 as? He said, as a national uprising. And so that was fascinating to me. I mean, that means that even this sort of marquee event that is the closest of these historical, backdrops is now subject to intense debate. But so I think that's pretty important. Again, the Iranian obsession that United States and Israel want to break up Iran. These are memories of 19th century. Right. That's what the French, that's what the British and the Russians would do. So, in other words, that the chess game that the Iranians play is informed by this history. And we have to understand not just the history in an objective sense, but the particular way they are reading this history. Because I think ultimately, when Iran changes, there has to be another dominant rereading of that history.
Excellent. I think this is a good point to bring Ali into the conversation. You've been very patient here. But I would basically invite you to react to this idea of a through line of uniqueness, aloneness that has the positives and negatives potentially that we've been discussing. Can you give how do you read that? And what do you share and where do you diverge?
First of all, I got to know the works of Professor Nasr when I was much younger than today. I was a research intern at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and my spare time I was using at the library of the Foundation for Iranian Studies in Bethesda. And one of the series of books which I discovered over there was a series of oral history interviews where other young people, students of politics in mid-1980s were engaged in interviewing the elites of the Pahlavi regime, fundamentally asking them why did the revolution happen? And one of the interviewers, brilliant interviewers, I have to say, of course, was then Dr. Vali Nasr. So I was inspired by your work from very early on. And to answer your question, as I see it right now, Iran is facing two very fundamental threats, which are somewhat similar to the threats that the Shah's regime is facing. Internally, the Pahlavi regime managed to modernize Iran, but never intended to democratize Iran. And the result of this, in other words, the combination of modernization minus democratization always results in social revolutions. In other words, young people who were sent to study at American universities, learn about democracy, they returned back to Iran, and their numbers, by the way, exceeded 100,000 individuals, many of whom were studying in America with tuition fees paid for by the Pahlavi regime. And His Imperial Majesty was expecting that these young people would come back to Tehran and say, "Thank you, Your Majesty, for financing my education." Of course they did. They demanded democracy. And here the Pahlavi regime failed. And the Islamic Republic is committed, has committed for the past 40 years, exact same mistakes. Continued modernization of Iran, but minus democratization. This is why large parts of Iran's urban middle class has turned against the regime. So there is no popular backing for the regime. It was with the greatest of difficulties that Dr. Pezeshkian managed to have 50% of Iranians to go out and vote in the last presidential elections in Iran, because most people simply don't believe it. They do not believe in the system. So at home, the regime is facing a legitimacy crisis. Abroad, the Shah's regime was facing problems with Iraq, first and foremost, back then, the Soviet ally. And the Savak invented the idea of proxy warfare by supporting Kurdish groups, particularly the Barzani family, but at times also the Talabani clan. These two clans were Iranian proxies fighting Iran's war against the central government in Baghdad from 1960 to 1975. Now, it's a very long period of time, and it was a sensational success. The Islamic Republic took the idea of proxy warfare and made it into a part of its national security strategy. It worked for Iran. The Shah knew that at some point the United States was going to deny arms to Iran. There were several cases, specific weapon types that Iran was requesting. The US was delivering those weapon types, weaponries, to Turkey, a NATO member, but not to Iran. So what did Iran do? Iran, in cooperation with Israel, began reverse engineering those missile types on Israeli soil. By the way, that program continued until a couple of years ago, where the government of Israel had to pay $1 billion back to the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite all the sanctions, because it was Iranian money invested in the joint project. And the third element of the Shah's national security strategy was the nuclear program. The idea back then was to bring Iran on the verge of nuclearization, on the verge of having a nuclear weapon. CIA knew this, and it was a political problem here in Washington. All these three elements, proxies, missiles, and the nuclear program, also became fundamental pillars of the national security strategy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, as Professor Nasr correctly points out in his book. Now, the problem today for the Islamic Republic is that two of those three pillars have collapsed. The proxy project collapsed as Israel managed practically to dismantle Lebanese Hezbollah in September of 2020, the pager attack. Since the pager attack, we have not seen Hezbollah playing a serious role in the conflict between Iran and Israel. And today, Lebanese Hezbollah is struggling for its survival as an armed force in Lebanon. The second pillar, Iran's missiles. Only one type of missile managed to break through the multi-layered defense systems of Israel, and that was the hypersonic missiles, of which Iran has a very small arsenal. All other missiles, they were intercepted by Israeli and allied air defense systems. So that is the second pillar of Iran, which is collapsed. The third one is the nuclear. Now, we do not know how much of it is left, and I do not know if it is technically feasible for the Islamic Republic to build a weapon. But in order to rush for the bomb, they have to make very great decisions among Iran's decision makers. And here, maybe I'm telling you something which is slightly controversial.
Don't worry about that.
But this is about the decision makers, because I am urging all of you in this room and our esteemed viewers practically to disregard Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has, for the past year, not been the ultimate decision maker in Iran. Instead, we have seen emergence of a leadership council. The leadership council consists of the heads of the three powers of the state, meaning the president, the head of the executive, the head of the judiciary, and the parliamentary speaker, the head of the legislature. These three individuals are joined by one representative from the Revolutionary Guard and one individual from the Islamic Republic of Iran army. This collective leadership has been making decisions in Iran for the past year. This did not even begin after the Israeli attack against Iran. The best example of it is the hijab legislation. The Iranian parliament passed the legislation imposing extreme punishment of those Iranian women not abiding by the hijab legislation. President Pezeshkian said, I do not know, this is the exact quote, I do not know how to enforce the law and therefore I will not enforce it. Then he said, if you really want me to enforce it, I will resign. After which the heads of the three powers of the state, they met, and against all legislation, what they did was clearly illegal. They said that we are not going to follow the law because it's going to provoke Iranian women to go to the streets. There will be another round of anti-regime protests. Exactly.
Okay.
The law is not enforced.
Right.
The second element is that Israeli attack against Iran and the 12-day war forced Ayatollah Khamenei into hiding. So he is physically detached from the decision makers. During the war, one meeting, perhaps one chance of preventing US intervention in the war was lost because the US said they wanted to have one American official meet Iran's foreign minister, Dr. Araghchi. Dr. Araghchi needed authorization from Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei, fearing assassination by Israel, had to away his phone, so he could not be reached. Dr. Araghchi did not meet his American counterpart. Now comes the second part, which is just as important. When the US offered Iran ceasefire agreement, the Iranian leadership accepted without authorization from Ayatollah Khamenei. In other words, we have 5 individuals in Iran making the decisions. No need to look at the Khamenei factor anymore, in my opinion, and analysis.
Okay.
And the second element is that, and I'm going to end my little intervention here. I'm much more interested in hearing from Professor Nasr than repeating what I have been writing, for you all these years. It is that there are 3 scenarios that Iran is now facing. These 5 individuals. One is capitulation.
Yep.
To the United States, and we can debate these things further. The other one is dashing for the nuclear bomb. And there is also a third path, which is continued negotiations combined with, unfortunately for our Arab friends, attacks against regional energy infrastructure. These 3 choices are the ones that the 5 individuals in charge in Iran are now facing. Okay. And every single decision is going to entail terrible risks.
Yeah. All right. So that's pretty sweeping. And I'd like to sort of invite Professor Nasr to respond to 1 or 2 elements in that. I think we'll get more to the present day crises that Ali has raised. I didn't bring them up yet because I thought we should lay a basis for the conversation, and I think we did do that. But I think, for example, really struck by the way you described, for example, how the coup, the second and successful coup against Mossadegh in 1953, is used as a, as you say, you don't have to explain these things, like Munich, you say Munich in the West, and people know what you mean. Is used by contemporary hardliners. So, as a way of shutting down the conversation. Basically, that I think this is more or less, according to your description, how it works. And so what I kind of like you to talk about for a second is 2 things that are connected but not the same. One is how Iran's history very long, very complex, very rich history. Both informs leadership decisions at the moment, and also how it is used, how it's deployed politically, right? As a rationalization, as an explanation, and as a way of marketing, if I may put it that way, decisions or outcomes that need to be explained at some point to the broader public, right? By getting public buy-in. So could you address those two, factors, please?
Absolutely, and also building on what Ali was
Go
saying,
right ahead.
I would say, and he's correct. I mean, the Islamic Republic has lost any kind of a monopoly, I would say, on public discourse, and this is not just over the issues of democracy, freedom of press, etc. It's also about the foreign policy issue. Although we're now sort of in a fog of the post-war, and this might be a changing scenario, but as I said, a state that is being built around war, I think one of the most important critiques of the population is about the reason why we're where we are.
Yeah.
Right. And at least, on some things you could say the reason is Islam and Islamic ideology, but Iran's economy cannot be explained in terms of Islamic ideology.
Right.
The economy is what it is, based on even the assessments of the people in the government itself because of the sanctions. And this is very clear that in presidential elections in Iran, when Dr. Pezeshkian was running, he was saying that to improve the economy, sanctions have to be lifted. To lift sanctions, I have to talk to the US.
Right.
And whereas his opponent was saying that, no, I can grow the economy at 8% under sanctions, at which point Pezeshkian said, I'll bow out of the election if you execute him, if he doesn't perform.
Yeah.
Which means that, the two-ton elephant in the room in the economy is this issue. So I agree that the population no longer buys into the fundamental assumptions of this strategy of resistance, muqawama, or that does not, or even if those who believed in it don't believe its shelf life has expired, or that the way you're prosecuting it is perhaps not advisable. So I think they have a great deal of difficulty necessarily sort of having a coherent message that right now would be able to create a national consensus the way they had in the 1980s or maybe even the 1990s in support of their foreign policy. I think it's much more what that smaller elite on the top thinks, right?
Sure.
And now there's 5 people, a bit larger, etc., that what's their mindset? And I think it is very clear that they basically share, if you would, a particular view of the 1953 coup and what it meant. They clearly don't share my assessment that this was an Iranian coup supported by the US. It was not the coup that the US planned. That one failed a few days earlier.
Yeah.
This was a coup that General Zahedi, whose son was a famous ambassador here, conceived. I mean, I've even talked to his lieutenants. He spent months preparing this, of meeting secretly underground with individual, colonels and lower-ranking officers who had been his students for years. And they would secretly travel to Tehran at night, meet with them, plan, leave. And he put it together. There was no way the United States could have conceived of that coup. And that, as one of these people have now passed during those oral history told me, he said, why do you think the United States used us? Why don't you think that we used the United States, right? Because we thought Mossadegh was a danger to Iran's national security. It wasn't personal. It wasn't about the British. It wasn't about the oil. It was about the fact that, he was paving the way for Soviet Union and communism, right? So clearly, this leadership doesn't see it this way. They see it along the lines that they see it. So to them, the United States means Iran ill. It's an enemy. It wants to change the regime. It wants to repeat 1953 in some form, even now, that to get rid of the Islamic Republic. And so, that hasn't changed. The question is, how do you deal with the United States?
Right.
How do you deal with the threat?
And you wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that I wanted to talk about.
But just to finish this, because the other piece of this, which I think is key, is the Iran-Iraq war.
Right.
So, all of these, including Khamenei, basically their earliest lesson in statecraft was the Iran-Iraq war. And the lesson they took from Iran-Iraq war is that Iran does not want to defend itself on its borders. It has to defend itself much farther away. Iran's borders with Iraq are not defensible, not unless you have tanks and jet aircraft, which the United States was not going to give Iran. You have to defend yourself in the Arab world. This is the idea of forward defense.
Yeah.
I mean, they would say that, you have to have Israel busy on its borders so it wouldn't be busy on our border.
Mm.
So they're back to where they were in the Iran-Iraq war.
Mm.
They now have to defend Iran with whatever they have on their own borders. They cannot do it in the Arab world anymore. But how they respond to this moment, I think, draws back to what their experience in the 1980s. The other experience they took was that Iran was alone. Iran is alone again. Nobody supports it. Everybody supported Saddam in 1980s. And perhaps the third one is that what happens early in the war is not the war, it's all the war. And for 2 years, Iraq occupied Iranian territory. They found a way to eventually eject Iraq. So yes, they need negotiations. They need to settle things down. But, they have to live to fight another day.
Yeah.
They're not kamikaze in that way. Contrary to what conception on the outside is. So I think, the key issue is what's in the mind of those 5-10 people that are actually the key decision makers. And I do think those scenarios that Ali put on the table are the ones that they have to contend with. Capitulation is not an option without basically packing their bags and leaving. Lash to the nuclear weapons is not feasible, not before they have air defense systems and deal with their intelligence goals, which is not a short-run issue.
Yeah.
So the only option there is if there is a pathway to de-escalation.
Yeah.
And I think, for them, a nuclear negotiation is essentially, in effect, its value is that it would be a informal cessation of hostilities deal with Israel, something like what happened after 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel, sort of unspoken red lines negotiation, so the war stops.
Yeah. So let's talk about this issue of the strategy, the failed strategy, the definitively failed strategy of using Arab militia groups as a forward defense against Israel and the United States, because when you raise the word muqawama, right? Muqawama begs you resistance. Muqawama against whom? And it's often used, without a complementary signifier, just used as a kind of a general sense that the status quo is not okay, and we are resisting the status quo. And of course, most people assume, and I think this is how it's intended, muqawama against Israel and the United States, ultimately. But the question then becomes, how do you ultimately deal with the failure of the proxy group strategy? Can you talk about where it came from? How do you view it? You do go into it quite a lot in your book, but I'd like you to give our audience a summary of your take on Iran's forward defense strategy through proxies and its failure. And what is Iran going to abandon it? Are they going to keep it going just in hopes that it can accomplish something someday? Or maybe you could argue that at least it prevents states like Iraq or Syria or others from reintegrating and stabilizing in a way that they become actors rather than battlegrounds, and that it is better for Iran to be surrounded by fragmented, I mean, this is the way the Israelis are increasingly viewing their neighborhood, that it's better, and they say it openly about Syria, better to have a fragmented, disintegrated Syria that is chaotic than an integrated, powerful neighbor to the north on that. How does, let me clarify more. Where did the proxy strategy, forward defense strategy come from? And how is Iran going to now deal in your view, with its decisive failure, unless you think it's not such a decisive failure, but please go ahead.
No, I mean, it is definitely a turning point. Where does it come from? I think Ali's point about having roots in the Pahlavi period is very much there.
Another through line.
Yeah, another through line, and actually, there's even one Iranian scholar found in Sabak archives that there was this thing called the Green Plan, which was about basic building an Iran base in Lebanon by funding Imam Musa and Amal. Musa Sadr, and there is this Iranian colonel who was in charge of the Middle East who said that in order to not shed our blood defending Iran, we have to fight in the Eastern Mediterranean, which could have been words out of General Soleimani's mouth.
Again, that notion, fight them there.
Fight them there, exactly. And in fact, the Shah had its own vision of forward defense. It was sometimes not through just proxies, it was also through intervention in Oman, it was through building an alliance with Sadat, and opportunity arose when Arab nationalism weakened. An alliance with the Assad family. So it was not the same kind of forward defense, but he had also a notion that Iran needed to protect itself within the Arab.
There are very many echoes, that's for sure.
But I think the major turning points, at least based on sort of what the Iranian material shows, one is the big debate after 1982 when Iran pushed Iraq out. And there was this big conversation about whether Iran should stop the war, accept the peace, or pursue. And Iranian generals, in particular IRGC and regular military generals, argue that Iran's border is not defensible. Iran needs a beachhead in Iraq. And then some, including Khomeini, said that Saddam's just going to go back and arm and come back, and we cannot keep mobilizing a volunteer army. He has to be removed from power. So you have to capture Basra, capture the oil fields, force Saddam to fall, and that sort of got them into the fact that they have to be inside Iraq. And then after 1982, the argument is that Israel's attitude towards Iran changed. Until 1982, Israel didn't want Saddam to win. There was intelligence cooperation between Iran and Israel. Israel sold Iran military spare parts that it needed, all under the table, not openly. But after 1982, then Israel's priority became that now Iran doesn't win. And that's when the Iranians basically begin to look at Lebanon as a place to put pressure on Israel. And then the third one is that the Iranians were convinced that if the Americans successfully invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam in 2003 and did this too comfortably, that then Iran and Syria would be next. And Soleimani's mission was not sort of ideological, it was just make sure that the Americans would not succeed. And he was successful in that, right? So in a way, and then, to the fact that why Syria shouldn't be allowed to fall, and Iran to be able to wage a war in Syria in order to prevent Assad from falling, all of which, had a national security argument, but all of them led into this thing that the only way to defend Iran is using these proxy forces. To fight in the Arab world. Now, what I follow in the debate in Iran is there's two sort of, the main trend is, yes, the collapse has happened. And not just the fall of Hezbollah, but also taking your eye off of Assad. And Assad was lost before he fell. He had already begun to make his peace with Israel and UAE, etc. And the argument, I think, is that, look, forward defense was a successful strategy. Its time has passed, right? In other words, just because it fell in 2023, those who defend it argue that it doesn't mean that it didn't buy Iran 40 years of success. It doesn't mean that Israel could not bomb Iran in 2015, 2018, 2022, etc. Why? Because we couldn't deal with Hezbollah. The fact that Americans didn't settle in Iraq, they didn't invade us. These are all seen as victories. So it's not. So the question is, where do they go from here? Much like the nuclear issue, restoration of Hezbollah is not an easy thing. If there is some means of, I would say, Hezbollah playing a role in Lebanon, in the future, political, etc., it's nowhere close to being the kind of deterrence that would prevent Israel from freely bombing Iraq, right? In fact, even Israelis would say that the most important element of Iran's air defense was actually Hezbollah, not what Iran had in air defense. Iraq in particular is different. I think that the sense is that if Iraq were to fall, if the current dispensation in Iraq were to fall, that then again Iran would be directly threatened on its border by a Sunni proxy of the United States.
Yeah.
That's the way they read it. So it's not about just chaos, etc. It's just like you cannot afford the calculation for defending Iraq is very different from defending Hezbollah. This is actually
its proximity.
And because of the Iran-Iraq war, because don't forget, the people who are making these decisions fully remember, like when they were 17 years old and they were fighting for
liberation in the crucible.
Right. So that's the crucible in which they were trained. That this is very, very different than Yemen, for instance, right? It might be expendable. And I would say, I think Syria is playing a very interesting role because yes, I mean, it looks like Israel is carving out Syria and Lebanon, sort of a, I don't know, even a Maroline canton, a Druze canton.
Yeah.
But all of this, particularly in Syria, is because of what is seen by the Druze or the Alawites, etc., as the fundamentally sectarian nature of al-Sharra's government. So the reading on the ground by Shias and by Iran is not the one that the West has of al-Sharra.
Right.
Even at the best, even if you gave him every benefit of the doubt that he, and I joke, it's like the Iranians think it's now the Sunnis practicing Taqiyya.
Let me just state for our audience,
dissimulation.
Yeah, it's sanctioned, religiously justified dissimulation to deceive in order to protect yourself or what have you.
Which the Shias are usually accused of and Iran is accused of, but the Iranians would say, the Iranians and the Shias in the region would basically say that, he's not what you're saying. Don't just look at him, look at all the people around him, etc. But that has obviously, we see in Syria has spooked the Druze, has spooked the Alawites. And so is this notion not just of Israel carving out these countries, but of what does a Sunni government in Syria, potentially backed by Israel, or is room to maneuver made possible for Israel? What does it mean for Iraq?
Yeah.
What does it mean for Lebanon? So partly protection of Hezbollah right now, even its weapons or the PMF in Iraq is not necessarily just about fighting Americans or Israelis. It's about not losing the balance of power that they won in 2003 onwards completely. What's on the table for them is to be back to 2003, March 2003, when Saddam controlled Iraq, that Iraq can unravel, Lebanon can unravel, and then everything can unravel. Right? So that's a completely different, I think, strategic threat that they feel they're facing.
And they do see that as threatening.
I think they do. I mean, look, you may, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people are not after you.
Right.
I mean, it's like, I mean, in other words, again, you have to look at the mindset, and you have to look at the mindset of even the proxies in the region. What are they telling them? Right. There is not this sense of comfort in terms of what's happening in Damascus, and then the alliances that al-Sharra is relying on, which on one side is the Sunni part of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Which, even though it's extending a hand to Iran, etc., doesn't mean that they wouldn't want to restore the Sunni access. And then on the other side is Israel, which is, yes, is bombing al-Sharra, but is also meeting with them, is facilitating his presence. So there's a lot on the table that basically I think Iran would find extremely threatening.
So Israel wants a weak al-Sharra Syria. They're kind of comfortable with him there as long as his country is fragmented and he's scrambling every day to survive. That I think is their idea.
But maybe enough for him to be able to have a role in Iraq or in Lebanon instead of not against Israel or the US, but enough to play a regional.
Exactly, and I think that is sort of what they're going for. But they will discover that they don't control Syria. Anyway, no, they'll find that out at some point. Right now, they're drunk with power, without a doubt. But I mean, not every Israeli, but the state is behaving that that way. So I'm gonna invite everybody in the audience to ask questions through the Q&A function. We have some, they're good. We'll get to them in a sec. But I wanted to ask Ali to weigh in briefly on the question of the proxy strategy, and is Iran likely to I mean, surely they're not going to abandon this 40-year project of Hezbollah. That I think we can just all stipulate it, right? But how much are they ever likely to return to this as a cornerstone of national security? Are they likely to spend a great deal of time and money on this? Would you think they would be comfortable with Hezbollah becoming a large political party with a small militia rather than a large militia with a small political party? How do you read this situation?
Going back to the idea that my proposition that Ayatollah Khamenei should be excluded from analysis, and we should be focusing on 5 individuals. 5 individuals. These 5 individuals are fundamentally convinced that Israel's objective, strategic objective, is no longer Iran's nuclear program. These 5 individuals are convinced that Israel wants to overthrow the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And not even just that, fragmentation of Iran through a civil war is the objective. And they refer to an editorial in the Jerusalem Post calling for the world leaders to support the uprising of ethnic minorities in Iran against the central government. Now, in other words, it is not a paranoia. It is not just
I actually think they're right about
crazy idea.
No, I think that it's a good
It is rooted in reality,
strongly
in expressed policies of the government of Israel, and also what they have been doing, because the Iranian government can document contacts between the government of Israel and armed insurgencies in Iran's periphery regions. Now, if that is the threat that Iran is facing, they need to put their money where it matters most. But the definition of where money matters most and where you can get most value for your funds, that obviously is something that is a matter of debate among the 5 individuals. And it depends on the different bureaucracies. So we have bureaucratic politics in Iran, just as there are bureaucratic politics in Washington. State Department has not the same view of the world as Pentagon or the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. So there are different bureaucracies with different opinions. And right now, it appears as if that the Quds Force faction within the Revolutionary Guard is weakened.
because
of the failures. Even the missile command of the Revolutionary Guard, the AGSI Air and Space Command, has also been somewhat weakened because of the limited efficacy of most Iranian missiles. What remains is the hypersonic missiles, and everybody believes that that is something that Iran needs to invest in. And that obviously also leaves the door open for a future nuclear command of the revolution. Now, that objective of building a nuclear weapon, we cannot say anything intelligible about it because we do not have the data. But that is a decision that these 5 individuals need to make at some point. And they have to really accept all the risks and do it in order to establish some kind of a balance of terror between Iran and Israel and prevent future Israeli attacks. If that objective is not within reach in the next couple of years, then they have the middle choice that they have, the middle course. This middle course involves the Yemeni Houthis. So the only part, it is no longer Lebanese Hezbollah, which is being discussed in Iran. It is the limited value of the Houthis in order to put pressure on the regional energy infrastructure. There are very serious Iranian analysts close to the Revolutionary Guard arguing that this is the path and this is the tactic that Iran needs to pursue. Their idea, and I'm specifically thinking about Dr. Mehdi Kharatian, who is a very serious analyst, his argument is that the United States did not pay any price for bombing Iran. Neither did Israel. Israel, paid a limited price. Limited price. The global economy was not impacted at all. So we need to impact the global economy. And the argument that he's making, and many other analysts close to the Revolutionary Guard, is that Iran was not compensated. Iran did not gain anything for the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iran and United Arab Emirates. Iran normalized relations and practically signaled to the entire world that you are welcome to bomb us. We are not going to touch Arab oil. No, he's saying that Iran should do the reverse. Iran should be engaged in limited, indirect attacks against regional energy infrastructure.
In other words, going back to the year of maximum resistance with gray zone warfare.
Iran needs to impose a pressure on oil exporters and oil importers.
Yeah, I understand.
Hoping that both importers and exporters will put pressure on Israel to stop attacking Iran, because the Iranian leadership, they believe that Israel is going to break the ceasefire.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In order to achieve its unmet objectives of regime change in Tehran and perhaps even fragmentation.
So I want to go before we move on from this issue of the axis of resistance and the muqawama and how it functions, etc. I was really struck in the early parts of your book by the language that you use to describe where the so-called axis of resistance and where muqawama is in the context of the war in Gaza and what has happened ever since. I mean, you say that it was a bold manifestation of the ascendance of the axis of resistance, and also that they demonstrated their power and reach along with an ability to upend America's plans for the region. And this includes Hamas, even though I would argue Hamas is, a very kind of a peripheral part of it, a marriage of convenience, on again, off again. But what I wanted to ask you is I must be misreading your interpretation of this, because it cannot be that the events of 2004 demonstrated the reach and the power.
2024.
2024, excuse me, my dyslexia again always comes up with dates and numbers. To me, it seems it demonstrated the opposite. Its lack of ability to do all those things. What do you make of the sort of collapse of that idea that it is this mighty network that has reach even into the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, is sort of very powerful grouping, block. But that's been exposing, as Ali was kind of saying, the only part of the muqawama thing that still poses any threat to anyone militarily are the Houthis. Because I don't think Hezbollah does anymore, the PMF groups don't, and these little brigades in Syria are gone. So what do you make of it?
I mean, I think it's a very good point. I think the perspective that you read was in the first year of the post-Gaza war, which their reading was that Israel is on its heels. It's not only its bleeding reputation, and it's not able to defeat Hamas despite.
I mean, before the pager explosions, this was a very good interpretation.
It was other. Now you see again. Now looking at the debates that they are having about who lost Syria, what happened. In other words, it's very clear that they had begun to sort of worry about Assad. He didn't join in on October 7th. They actually kicked out the Houthis out of Damascus right away. There are some analysts who would say that had he joined in, or had Syria had been fully weaponized, the war might have gone differently. But I think, partly there are those like the analysts that Ali mentioned, Kharatian, etc., who are saying that and these are veiled criticism of their own commanders
Right.
and veiled criticism of Khamenei to the extent that they see that, going back to even when Soleimani was killed, that you should have killed Americans. I mean, literally, they would say that these symbolic reactions basically invite attack. Or if when Haniya was killed, you should have used supersonic missiles at that point, and then Nasrallah would not be killed. And then, then even when Iran was hit right now, that you should, what is this thing you did with Qatar, like telling Trump it's going to come at 1 o'clock and it's going to be nice and neat. Right. In other words, they're basically making the argument that, so partly, there is a understanding that that particularly the intelligence coup that Israel carried out against Hezbollah was obviously a game changer.
Yeah.
Right. But and after that, essentially, and also there's this argument that they're dealing with an Israel 2.0, which is far less willing to accept deterrence. So when it hit Iran's consulate, it already was telling Tehran that they're not going to be hindered by the presence of Hezbollah weapons along the border. So dealing with this new Israel is an issue. I think the point
for sure
is that they're trying to salvage things out of it, which is that it cannot be this easy for Israel and the US to hit us. But I do think, I mean, eventually how they read the reasons for the collapse of the access, and then what parts of the access are helpful or useful going forward, and to what extent are I think subject to the debate. It depends on ultimately what strategy they embrace. If the strategy is all Gulf focused, then of course the Levant then doesn't matter. And they're not very invested. And I just would say that one of the issues that is very key with Hezbollah that Iran was struggling was actually giving Hezbollah the money that it needed to repair houses. Right. If you cannot support Hezbollah in rebuilding Israeli damage to civilians, then there's no point in for Hezbollah to go to war with Israel.
So the primary concern of the Gulf states is that not just that Iran, but now Israel is a destabilizing factor, that their antagonism is a destabilizing factor, that the United States is not a stabilizing factor that they would like. They feel very alarmed and very nervous about how Iran is going to react in the next year or two to the blows that were struck after the pager explosions. In other words, by the war in the full-blown war in Lebanon that lasted only a couple of weeks, and where Hezbollah never threw its punch against Israel. It was ready, it never threw it, and then before they knew it, in a matter of literally 2 weeks, they were decimated. So I want to, both of us, Ali, I'll come to you first if you want, but I think, I want to turn attention a little bit to the concern of the Gulf countries that all of this doesn't blow up again in their face and that they do not get exposed. As Ali has said now several times in this conversation, that they are not the ones who will be hit and pay the price for American or even Israeli actions vis-a-vis Iran. Ali, you had something? No? Okay. So I begin then with Professor Nasr. I mean, what would you tell a Gulf Arab leader who said, it comes to you and says, "Oh, Professor Nasr, I'm extremely nervous about this situation. What can you help me out to at least to understand it? Not necessarily advice or anything, but how do I understand Iran and how can they make things better for themselves?" Is really the question.
Well, I mean, there are two targets in the Gulf, I would say. So one is energy, the other is everything else in the Gulf.
Right.
Like it could also, in a worst case scenario, from infrastructure, cities, factories, et cetera, desalination, all of that can be hit. And I think there's a difference here because those would be direct attacks on the Gulf, whereas shipping and energy, maybe an attacks not on the Gulf, but actually on the Gulf's customers and on world energy. So these are separate things. The key issue, and I think Ali is absolutely right, that the effect of the détente has been basically to mitigate Iran's threat to the outside and the Gulf, but not the outside threat to Iran. And I think what's happened since President Trump came to office and on his first trip to the Gulf, and then now is that the Gulf countries have also shown to be unable to shape American policy.
Yeah, no.
Right. So the message to Iran when the president went there was that they're actually doing that. They were successful at it. We're going to make money here. You need to talk to Iran. UAE was the one who actually carried a letter to Tehran. The Qataris, the Saudis, they were all supportive of a nuclear deal. And in the end, they obviously are not able to influence Israel, but they're not also able to influence the US. So there's a level at which the Iranians would basically begin to discount what they can do. I would say there is one window here, which is key, and we'll know by the end of this month, is this snapback window. In other words, obviously the Arab countries are working very hard to be effective here. So the Egyptians have mediated, even though they don't have relations with Iran, mediated the meetings between Foreign Minister Araghchi and IAEA chief in Cairo. There is a tentative agreement which could help, but I wouldn't say it's a silver, but it could help if it went through. And I think the rest of the Gulf is also somehow working very hard to still try to see whether they can get Iran and the US to the table.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, but if that fails, then and if Iran is in a survival mode, they're not going to go down without scratching on every thing that they can get a hold on.
Right.
And then the cost of retaliation to Iran would actually go down, because if you're going to get hit anyways, if you're going to go after the supreme leader and killing your commanders and hitting your infrastructure anyways, you may as well try to see whether there's anything you can do. And then the détente could become expendable if your own survival is at risk, and if the détente actually does no value in terms of your survival.
Let's go right into that. Because on the one hand, you make it very clear in your book that the war in Gaza, as you say, it makes it clear that Iran today sees itself as the inspiration for a global movement of resistance to the United States. There's Maqawama directed against Washington. Okay. And that to achieve that, Iran is acting on assumptions that reflect historical experiences and imperatives and all that. Okay. But you have this very important and interesting piece in Foreign Affairs. The recent, it's very recent. It's entitled "Iran's Roads Not Taken," and in it you describe opportunities that both Tehran and Washington missed to de-escalate. And we have also got a viewer in Riyadh who wants to know about how Iran can be incentivized to temper itself under these conditions when, as you say, Iran sees itself as the vanguard of a global movement of muqawama at Washington, or maybe that view has changed. What do you think? I mean, tell us a little bit about these roads not taken and the opportunity you clearly think is still there.
Well, I would say, all of the above can be correct at the same time. In other words, when the US first engaged China or the Soviet Union, it was not it didn't immediately lead them to abandon communism. In fact, the Chinese, when Nixon went to China, escalated their support for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong.
Sure.
But you have to look at any kind of an Iranian-American engagement as a beginning, not as the floor, not the ceiling.
Right.
And maybe the tragedy of the nuclear deal was that, yes, it wasn't perfect, but you could only you would have had that survive before you could actually build on going to the next level.
Yeah.
So I mean, if it's the US or and I think the Saudis understood this, and that's why they engaged in it at the time.
Yes,
Fully expecting that the Islamic Republic is not going to change
right.
just because they went to Beijing and had that agreement. But if there is a decade of Iran-Saudi improvement of relations, and then there's some kind of sanctions relief that allows business to happen, etc., that you can gradually sort of influence the direction that things may at least move in the bilateral relationship. That changing Iran is a process. It's not a sudden act. I think that's and if you're Trump administration, that's the point I'm making, that there always are these opportunities, and it's important for the U.S. to recognize that and not think that there has been a black box in U.S.-Iran relations for 4 decades. That you don't want to go to a war in the Middle East. You don't want destabilization in energy and with Iran and with the Gulf. And there is not, unless there is absolute regime change in Iran, either you invade Iran and your tanks arrive in Tehran, and much like Kabul and Baghdad, you can dictate who takes over, or that you're surprised by a collapse like happened in Syria, which then you can deal with what's the aftermath. But if these 2 scenarios are not happening, you have to have a game plan of how you gradually veer off the cliff right now, because that's where we're closest to the cliff. Then once you veered off the cliff, how can you potentially move Iran in a different direction? And I think something Ali said is very, very important, which is this sort of sidelining of Khamenei, which might be like Mao's last years in Beijing when he was bedridden and hardly communicating.
Ignored, yes.
I think I think Iran was already in a succession conversation before the war started. And I think the war, in a way, has accentuated or accelerated the conversation about where Iran might go afterwards. And so partly, engaging Iran is about averting a war, moving away from the cliff, but you have to think of it as a longer run process to actually have an influence on that outcome. I don't know how we would play it. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns that are there. There's intelligence, etc., which is opaque to me. But I think that ultimately those 5 people are debating scenarios in front of them. And I think the key issue from my book, and I think Ali sort of underscored it, is not to think of Iran as this sort of ideology that is, we can't have an impact. It is key decision making. These people have assumptions. You can influence their decisions based on their assumptions, right? And the key question is, until you're engaged and you're in a room and you begin the process, you're not going to have that influence, right? So I emphasize not only the nuclear deal, but Afghanistan 2001.
Yes, definitely.
I mean, some Americans I've spoken to, they said they weren't confirmed because they said that we didn't know who these people were, but probably Soleimani and Rouhani were in the room. They're the ones who facilitated. Rouhani, I've heard from multiple sources, was the liaison with American officers because he was in charge of Afghanistan. It was successful. And I've heard also that Soleimani pleaded with the supreme leader, and he was instrumental in actually facilitating cooperations with the Americans for Iran's own national interest, which is get rid of the Taliban. But it could have been a beginning if immediately they were not put on an axis of resistance. You could say, you got to move Iran 2 degrees at a time. Now, obviously, we don't have time for 2 degrees. We need bigger degrees of movement. But short of war or regime collapse, you have to work with the regime you're in, and you have to figure out how you basically not only influence its immediate decisions, but influence the longer term decisions, which Ali said, they have some big decisions to make. Are we really, is our back to the wall and we need to go for nuclear? Is our back to the wall to the extent that we should just completely mess up the Middle East? Or is there a pathway to some kind of a de-escalation in the short-term period? And then 2 years from now, 6 months from now, 5 years from now, when Khamenei dies, I think that context would then decide what the succession would look like. Right?
Yep. No, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, Ali, talk about all of this de-escalation relations with the US, etc.
So I'm slightly pessimistic, and it has to do with Washington, not so much with developments and dynamics in Tehran. It appears as if President Trump believes that the Iran problem has been solved. After all, he believes that the nuclear program is obliterated, and it does not really feature so much on his mind. He has grown tired of it. He has moved on to other subjects. And if the Iran problem is solved, why on earth should the US government pay more attention to the Iran issue? So that I think is one problem. Second problem is that the current administration appears to have given some kind of a blank check to Israel. And the government of Israel wants to cash that blank check as fast as possible, because we do not know how a long time we are going to have President Trump among us. And we do not know what will happen after President Trump's term is over. In other words, Israel is in a hurry to cash in the check that it has received from the current administration. This also means that Israel has a very strong incentive to resume the war, resume hostilities against Iran as soon as possible in order to achieve the unmet strategic objectives of the Israeli state, which is regime change and fragmentation of Iran. In this context, the extreme choices that the 5 individuals in Iran and the Supreme National Security Council have to make is going to be historical and decisive and possibly, quite possibly, catastrophic. And which is why I believe that the middle road, which is not particularly good for the Arab states, is the most likely scenario. Iran will continue tactical negotiations with the United States, knowing that it is not going to lead to anything. Negotiations are not going to resolve arms problems. At the same time, Iran threatens to, or actually through intermediaries, attacks the regional energy in order to impose a cost on the United States, on the global economy, and make the issue of greater interest to President Trump, because clearly that is the only thing that President Trump is interested in. If you listen to the analysis of coming out of Iran from serious IRGC analysts, the one piece of intelligence that they are referring to continuously is Vice President Vance's comments in the leaked Telegram chat. It was not Telegram, Signal Gate, in which he expressed concern about the increasing price of oil. Should the United States attack the Yemeni Houthis? And this is something that they are using in their argumentation, saying that in order to make the US administration, the president and the vice president, interested in reaching some kind of agreement with Iran, that is the button that we need to push. Attack against energy. So that makes me somewhat concerned about the future of the data between Iran and the Arab states, and also the regional flow of energy.
Yes, quick footnote. The check is not blank. Israel has been given a wide berth, a wide range of things it can do.
That's semantics.
But no, because after
is there anything that Israel is not allowed to do?
Yes, I'm getting to that. After Trump declared Iran's nuclear program obliterated, which it obviously wasn't, and the war over, he got wind of an Israeli airstrike that was in progress, that was headed towards Iran. And he got on TV and the phone and social media and throwing around F-bombs and using a harsh expletive-laden language, said, call off that airstrike. And it was called off. And I think you can read something into the virtually established fact that the US was notified of the strike in Qatar before it happened, but way too late to do anything about it. In other words, minutes ahead of time. And a lot of people don't believe that. I do believe it, because I think the Israelis know that on occasion, Trump is capable of saying no. And that's one example where he did say no. And the second example is one where they feared he might say no, and they didn't give him any opportunity to say no. Once it's done, of course, he's not going to complain about it. So I do think
they decided to do something similar. Paul called President Trump minutes before restarting the war.
I don't know how the Israelis would deal with it, and I don't know if Trump would care, and I don't know what opinion he will have. I'm just saying you cannot look at the past year and say, okay, there's a totally blank check. There is an asterisk that is significant here. It's something you need to factor in. We all need to factor in. All right, we're running low on time. So I want to, there's a very good question we got from Paul Arts here, one of our viewers, who wants you to elaborate on how foreign policy in Islamic Republic are determined by domestic considerations and interests. And what's the balance? And I want both of you to talk about that, of sort of international concern and domestic politics, whether it's bureaucratic, public opinion oriented, whatever, in the decision-making process. And I'll begin with Professor Nasr, but I'm really interested to hear what Ali has to say about that too.
I mean, there's two ways of thinking about this. One is that there is a faction within the Islamic Republic, not necessarily always at the table, which actually has tried to push Iran towards a different pathway. This is President Rouhani, Rafsanjani, Khatami, even Pezeshkian, that we sort of have to go a little bit more of the Pahlavi route. You know, there's economic development matters, modernization matters. So you need to cool it off on regional issues, on be willing to negotiate on nuclear issues. And, you know, to some extent, they get a leeway, partly if there's too much crisis in the economy, or there's a very clear public pressure on it. The supreme leader has yielded, but they've never dominated in a way to completely reorient Iran in that direction. So, but I would not say that they're ephemeral the way Washington writes them off, right? And I do think the nuclear deal was sort of the apogee, that you had a president who pushed it, was willing to stick by it, and had it lasted, then you could have pushed further.
Yeah.
And I would say there is something to this, because even Rouhani's office, I learned, had done a study that if the nuclear deal had been implemented over a 10-year period, the size of Iran's middle class would have risen by 35%, which to him was the way you would change the regime.
Sure.
Right? As opposed to something sudden. But
and would that be positive change in his point of view?
It would have been. In other words, if we're talking about a glasnost, about a sort of that, in Rouhani's thinking, that would have been my constituency, right? The next election, you would win with 80% if that were the case.
Yeah.
But I would generally say that no. I mean, I think it's the reverse. I think generally my own take is that Iran is a state that has been shaped to accommodate this foreign policy increasingly. And at the beginning, you would say you could rally the crowd to come and chant in front of the American embassy, but you basically shaped your society, your economy, etc. Iran's economy has been shaped around accommodating this war. I mean, Iran is running out of water because in 2010, after President Obama managed with secondary sanctions, they made a decision that they have to be food self-sufficient. So all the water is diverted in ways that it shouldn't be in a normal country that does trade and manages its water, that it overproduces its food, not to be food reliant. So Iran's economy is being shaped around this. And I think partly they're losing their public because it's the cost is too high. And it's not just ideological. The population thinks there's a different way of protecting Iran, etc., rather than this path. So I think my point is also maybe the 12-day war actually has postponed this, because when countries go through war, nationalism, etc., kicks in. But the real reckoning for this policy is it's reaching the edge of where it might have led to serious public discontent. And when Pezeshkian says the only way to address the economic issues is to have a deal with the US, he's basically saying you need to change your foreign policy. So I think this is a foreign policy that has ran counter to what the public demand is, and the gap is widening. And those voices within Iran that want to ride that public demand, and currently the Iranian president is one of them, is only getting so far. They're not able to break out of this sort of cordon of this foreign policy.
Yeah, no, I think that's very.
And Ali, you.
Yeah, I want to hear what Ali thinks about the balance between.
I completely agree with Professor Nasr. the regime in Tehran is not insensitive to the public opinion. And the public opinion has, for many, many, many decades, been in favor of having normal diplomatic relations with the United States of America. And one of the reasons why the different politicians sabotage any attempt to improve relations with the US is exactly because they want to deny a diplomatic and political victory to their own opponents at home.
Sure.
Even President Ahmadinejad wanted to have improved relations with the US, even President Ahmadinejad. And let me just, this is not actually a joke, but let me finish with this. It is said in Tehran that one of the reasons the regime is deeply concerned about the reopening of US embassy in Tehran is that it will cause even more traffic chaos, as Iranian will queue up, line up in front of the embassy asking for applying for visa.
Yeah, I don't think that is a joke.
As another, embarrassment to the regime 46 years after, the hostage taking of American diplomats in Tehran.
LA is a nice town to live in. Professor Nasr, I want to give you the last word. You've written a brilliant book. Congratulations on it, and thank you for writing it, because anyone who's interested in Iranian foreign policy, that's sort of it's the first stop, and it's going to be, I think, the definitive book on this topic for a couple of decades at least. So, you've really contributed something extremely important here. And I'd like to give you the last word on where you see, just very, very broadly, and I understand fair to be this broad, but just, where do you see Iran's foreign policy right now? A lot of people are writing stuff, even Iran on the brink. Anytime people write an article with the headline "on the brink," they have no idea what is going on. Yeah, the brink of what? They never say of what. It's like Muharram against what? I mean, it's just in itself a brink in itself. But I'd like you, as we close, to give us your sense of where Iran's international relations and national security strategy are at the moment, and what do you think the biggest threat and the biggest opportunities are in the coming few months, because we can't really see beyond that.
I think sometimes you could say the more things change, the more things stay the same. Because we went through a war and all of that, and even as Ali was laying out the scenarios, it's largely within the same parameters of the same strategy that we're at war with the United States. And what do we do? And I think maybe this war actually reinforced that they are actually the enemy. They did bomb us. Israel, whether as an ancillary to the United States or which supported the United States, is now an enemy. So fundamentally, there is a validation, but all the decisions are within the same parameters. Now, maybe it is too soon to expect that there would be foreign policy thinking that goes beyond this grand strategy that we've talked about of resisting the United States and combating the United States. But I think it takes us to the other part of it. Debates like this never happen, especially as intense and as sensitive in Iran, without the sort of what's on the table and what are the options. I think the point that he makes about the other side of the table is pretty important. In other words, if you're sitting with those five or their advisors and you are going to offer something completely different, short of capitulation, but even that is not necessarily, in Iran they would say, well, look at Shara, look at Assad went, and that's not the end of it. And Gaddafi, or Gaddafi, that it's not like if we came out, they're going to do this. But there is nothing on the table in a sense that you would say would push this in a very different direction. So unfortunately, there's another person in that decision-making group that Ali mentioned, and it's called Donald Trump. And how he sees this. I think leadership here does matter. I mean, if you had somebody like Bush or Nixon who thought strategically that this is a moment to shape this country for next 10 to 15 years, we might have had a very different kind of conversation. I think we're at a really, really critical point, because once they make the decision in Iran, then that's going to decide, what's the next chapter. Are we in a sort of a prolonged period of, tit for tat with Iran, or is there's going to be a much larger war that some people warn about that can have its own rule?
Yeah.
And I think this month is very critical. If snapback sanctions are confirmed at the UN, then how Iran reacts to them, then that can basically make a decision. And I think there is also a combination here between the middle path, but the goal being ultimately to use the middle path to get to the nuclear end, which is even more dangerous. So we are on brink of something. I don't think I don't think necessarily that it's the end of the regime or that it itself sees itself at that point. But the path forward is very dangerous.
No, I think we can all agree that the decisions that are made in Tehran and Washington, and possibly West Jerusalem as well, are going to be decisive in where things go in the coming decade. Generally, this is an inflection point, and how Iran reacts to the 12-day war, the collapse of the Awama theory or strategy, and all of that, and Israel's Israel's emergence as a kind of quasi-rogue state, basically. At least that's how they're behaving right now. Maybe that's just an impression they want to give, but they're giving that. If they're not a rogue state, they're doing a great job of impersonating one. So let me just thank you for the book, because the book is magnificent. Go buy it, go to our website, get the code, get the discount, but buy it. Yeah, you need to read this book. If you're interested in this issue, you need to read this book. And students in universities all over the world will be reading it for the next decade at least. So it's a major contribution. Thank you for that. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to everybody out there for watching. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time. It's inevitable. I don't really care. So I'm glad we did it because this is really good. And thank you again. Thank you, Ali. And thank you, Professor Nasr.
Thank you for inviting me.